Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Pete Eberle, and I'm with the Colorado Renewable Energy Society, or CRES as we like to call it for short, and want to thank you all for joining us tonight. For those of us that are unfamiliar with CRES, CRES and its local chapters provide education, policy advocacy, and community engagement that help accelerate Colorado towards a carbon neutral future powered by 100% renewable energy. Founded in 1996, CRES is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit that is supported by our sustaining individual members, our business sponsors, as well as donations. You can sign up for our newsletter, event announcements, social media, and become a member or a donor at cres-energy.org. That's CRES-energy.org. Also, make sure to check out our YouTube channel, where we have over 260 previously recorded presentations that have garnered over 1.4 million views. And once we get this edited, we'll have it up here in a couple weeks. So before I hand it off to Brian, a couple of quick announcements on upcoming events. So on Thursday, February 27th, that's this Thursday, 7 p.m. in Golden, Colorado, we will have How Not to Screw Up the Heat Pump Revolution. That will be an in-person and live streaming event, and it'll feature Stu Cummings and Ed Keene, who are experts with heat pumps and consultants with one of our friendly non-for-profits, Go Electric Colorado. And they are going to share their experiences on how to help you as a consumer make sure that you're buying the right heat pump. With new technology, there's always a challenge with vendor understanding of that technology, and lots of mistakes can be made in terms of sizing, in terms of vendors recommending a non-cold climate heat pump, which you should never get in Colorado and usually will not qualify for tax credits. So definitely tune into that and find out all the mistakes that you should avoid if you're considering getting a heat pump, either a full replacement or if you're on a gas furnace looking even at a dual fuel system. So again, that's this Thursday, February 27th. You can go to cres-energy.org to find out the registration on that. And then coming up on Tuesday, March 25th, 6 p.m., it'll be a webinar up here hosted again by the Northern Chapter, which we're in CRES up here in Fort Collins. Will be DERMS, grid flexibility, the problem, the solutions, and everything in between. We'll have Dr. Pablo Buelo, who is a senior energy services engineer with Fort Collins Utilities, and he'll discuss strategies to manage distributed energy resources to help achieve the city's 100% renewable energy target. So that'll be a really good one. Again, it'll be a webinar that is up on our meetup as well, or cres-energy.org. And I'll be configuring the Zoom login for that as well here shortly. But like I said, you should go to the website, sign up for our newsletter. We will have some interesting speakers coming up from the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority talking about transmission, which is a really critical aspect in the energy transition, as well as we're going to have the Colorado Energy Office present on their pathway to zero carbon electricity. And that will feature the Ascend Analytics study, which those of you that are the energy wonks know about that. But it'll be a really good presentation, and we'll have that up and scheduled once we firm up the dates. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Brian so he can share his screen and start talking about the cool LBNL study.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks everybody for joining. Happy to see some familiar names in the attendee list here. Thanks for deciding to spend some time talking about this study that we participated with Lawrence Berkeley Labs on over the past year and a half. It was kind of a standalone study, and when Pete and I were finalizing content in late January, Sean and the team from Lawrence Berkeley apologized on behalf of the federal administration for not being able to join and present the content. So I'm going to do my best, but with all this work, the experts here are identified on the screen, and Sean, Margaret, and Natalie, and the collaborators on my team at Fort Collins Utilities, Porva Bedge, Neil May, Pablo, who's going to be presenting in March, deserve a lot of the credit for this great body of work that I'm happy to share tonight. So again, questions will be kind of at the end. Pete, if you see something come in halfway through that's more clarifying, absolutely feel free to interrupt to seek clarity before moving on. But yeah, thanks again for joining and expressing interest in this work. You know, in large, I'll kind of talk about you know, and give you the punchline here in a few slides, and then back up and show you how we did a lot of the work. So the executive summary kind of outlining both motivations, research questions, but then findings, then backing out and looking more at the analytical approach that we took in order to give a little more background into some of the findings and how we got there. So yeah, overall, we were approached by Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and we've done a number of collaborative efforts in the past using a number of the AMI data resources that we have based on the infrastructure that we have here in Fort Collins. So, and the interest that we have in pursuing and achieving our community goals. So what Lawrence Berkeley essentially pitched to us was a collaborative effort using the meter data and also the NREL load shape work product that was complete in order to really develop a plan and include electrification and plan for planning purposes for utilities. Now the partnership was with both Fort Collins Utilities and SMUD. And SMUD had more of an interest in using this body of work to inform their IRP process. Whereas Fort Collins Utilities being a distribution utility, what we really wanted to dive into was the effects of electrification more at the feeder level than the resource level. So for those of you perhaps unfamiliar with the terminology, here in Fort Collins, we get power delivered from Platte River Power Authority to 7 different substations around the community. From those 7 substations, there's about 80 feeders that extend into the community to distribute power. After those 80 feeders, you know, anywhere between a dozen and, you know, hundreds of transformers below that out to secondary lines and into homes and businesses. So what we're really looking at with this study is electrification impacts at that feeder level, so right below the substation. And you know, there's a lot of variability that we see on the existing feeder infrastructure that we have in Fort Collins. But if you start thinking about all the different technologies that we're so excited for between EVs, heat pumps, even smart thermostats and other equipment, they all have a different load shape, right? And what we wanted to do with this study was look at, again, at that feeder level, what does the adoption of these different technologies do to the resulting load shape looked at our feeder level? So if you think about what adding an EV might do to my load shape in my home, it's unique to, again, just my home, right? If you start looking at what that load shape does across the transformer and across perhaps my neighborhood, you start to look at the diversity of the loads and perhaps when that EV might be plugged in versus when my neighbor's EV might be plugged in and when we're charging using different equipment. So, you know, you start to step back from the residential level with these different load shapes, and you start to include a lot of, you know, community variability and diversity in these different loads based on technology. You kind of try to piece together a bit of a puzzle to inform your planning at the distribution level. So that's trying to what we're understanding, trying to understand overlapping all of these technologies both at the household level first, but then building it all the way up to the feeder level to understand where we need to be as a distribution utility in 2040. This study was essentially forecasting out 15 years, what those loads look like, what the net loads look like. Again, you're reducing at some hours of the day, right? You're increasing loads at other hours of the day. So what do those net results look like? Just understanding what the technology adoption does there, really understanding the feeder level impacts. And, honestly, what we've done primarily as a distribution utility is looked at historical load growth at the substation and feeder level to predict essentially where we're going to be in a number of years. Using only, call it not sophisticated, rudimentary. I don't know. It's more based on historical trends and growth and information that we have based on individual feeders on, availability of land, for example, or, would we foresee, commercial loads coming onto this feeder, or would we foresee industrial loads coming onto this feeder? So this study was really focused mostly based on the variability of industrial loads and commercial loads and electrification. We're largely focused on heavily residential feeders and forecasting what those loads might look like. So, and last, ultimately, how do we manage that, right? How do we introduce the right combination of incentives for efficiency? How do we introduce the right flexible programs, such as what we have with our Peak Partners program, where we could, stagger thermostat loads or water heater loads or electric vehicle loads in order to mitigate some of these peaks that we might see. So it's kind of the foundation of the work that we had in this study, resulting in these research questions, right? What is both the magnitude and the timing of the peak demand look like across these different feeders for low, medium, and high electrification scenarios? How can, as I mentioned, efficiency and flexibility help with that and mitigate some of the, changes with that load? And ultimately, do we need to be looking at an accelerated feeder upgrade strategy and incorporating that into our capital improvement plans? So high level summary of the research that I'm presenting here. Essentially, to do that, I described briefly, but essentially we use the NREL load shape approach to look at, that net load. So what do we see, on the feeders? What are we monitoring for loads across the year? And essentially developing two different scenarios. We called it a baseline electrification scenario, where I'll share in a few minutes. That scenario is really just, using resistive electric water heating, resistive cooking equipment, a standard water heater or standard heat pump water heaters and kind of standard heat pumps. So kind of like just what it is, baseline electrification scenario, and also developed a high efficiency scenario where we considered envelope upgrades and all the right things that we should be doing to homes ahead of introducing a cold climate heat pump, for example. Again, looked at different levels of adoption based on the different feeders that we have, and also the building characteristics. So, for example, if we saw, I think we only saw like max 5% participation in some of our previous efficiency programs on any one feeder. But we did incorporate that into the building characteristics up front. So we looked at, it's kind of a mini potential study, and propensity for each one of these feeders to have more efficiency done on it. But again, I think we characterize in participation in our existing programs up to 5%. That doesn't account for all the great work that community residents do outside of our rebate programs or anything else. So yeah, 15 different feeders. Again, high level what we were doing, what we were looking at, and I'll kind of jump to, like I mentioned, the punchline, and we could go into more detail as needed. But what we were looking at, again, across these 15 different feeders that were selected, between essentially, I think that the data input was 2022, but 2022 to 2040, in this baseline scenario, we could foresee winter peak demand growing up to 134% on individual feeders, and also a corresponding growth in summer peak demand by about 59% by 2040. So largely you'll see, in later in this slide and in other areas, but heat pumps are the primary driver for the growth there. So we'll do a little comparison to other technologies as we go here. But what does that look like from a megawatt perspective? That's somewhere between 2.5 and 7 megawatts in the winter periods, and 1.5 and 5 megawatts in the summer. And as I mentioned, that heat pumps driving a decent amount of the peak demand growth, both in the winter and summer. And I did mention we did have a building characterization study and body of work that was incorporated. We do see about 75% AC use in Fort Collins. So, we will, as a result of installing high efficiency heat pumps, see more cooling, which again adds to load, but also adds to community comfort, adds to a resilient community, and especially in the face of rising temperatures. So skipping down to again, it kind of confirmed our assumption that winter peaking feeders are going to increase through 2040. And in the recent IRP collaboration that we had with Platte River, we're forecasting somewhere between 2038 and 2040, switching from that summer peaking to winter peaking utility. So kind of really just reaffirming some of our assumptions in that bullet. I was so happy to see that the incorporation of efficiency will really mitigate a lot of the growth in peak demand on the order of 20% across both winter and summer periods. So really confirming and reaffirming our utility investments and community investments in building efficiency in order to manage peak, not only peak, but also distribution infrastructure and the costs that utilities will ultimately need to pass down to the ratepayers as we continue our energy transition. We do see a shift in the minimum net demand more toward the middle of the day, and more in that 11 to 1 p.m. Window. And what that means from a distribution utility, we need to be cognizant of essentially what we call solar hosting capacity. So the way some of our equipment at our substations work, as I understand it, and I'm not a substation engineer, but essentially backfeeding to the substation is a big no-no. So this minimum net demand is really quantifying essentially the solar capacity that we can host on any one feeder, right? So understanding that minimum net demand and when it is throughout this 8760 profile of our energy use in the community It's really important in order to support growing local renewables. And lastly, the increases in peak demand, though significant from a percentage and load perspective, we looked at some of the cable constraints and some of our design constraints around the cable that's used for these feeders, and we actually did not see thermal overloads for in many of the scenarios. I think we maybe even only saw one in the highest growth type of scenarios. So we're really, again, it's a little bit of a balance there, even though it looks like high load growth from a percentage standpoint. We're really fortunate from a infrastructure standpoint in Fort Collins in being able to support essentially that growth in the loads on the individual feeders. So really interesting dynamic there. And all these findings are again supported by some of the analysis that I have in the following handful of slides. Not gonna, maybe just in the interest of time, I'm sure folks maybe have more questions than want to hear me rambling, but I'll just give again a high level approach that maybe will address a few of the outstanding questions that the group might have before turning to Q&A. So and again, I should share that this is kind of the abbreviated version of the LBNL study that's actually available. If you kind of Google the title of the presentation, you could find the 60 slide deck if you really wanted to dive deep into this work. But again, just kind of a foundational assumptions that were used in this work. What were some of the key assumptions, our baseline scenarios? Also kind of, well, they are in line with the Platte River IRP materials that are available on their IRP website as well. So if you wanted to look at kind of the different adoption scenarios, they would be a little more detailed there. But essentially, this is the baseline efficiency scenario. As I mentioned, more resistant cooking and clothes drying. Heat pump water heater, but really just kind of this single speed heat pump with backup electric resistance. Again, kind of the baseline scenario and what we might expect in this work. We do essentially, you see an inflection point here in what we would see from this net peak demand percent growth in 2030, mostly because we included in the assumption a change to an all-electric building code come 2030. Our local city council will be considering a new building code later this summer and later this year. But essentially, a lot of that trend really based on more electric new construction. Again, I won't dig too deep into this. Couple more interesting findings. This was kind of the comparison of the different technologies and their impacts on the net peak demand here. So on the left side, we have the increase to the summer demand in a medium electrification scenario versus on the right side, the winter impact. And you can see that the heat pump HVAC resource really driving the load growth in each scenario, especially compared to cooking and drying and heat pump water heaters that aren't necessarily driving or aren't even really showing up on the results here. But EV charging, heat pump, and then new construction also being a driver here at different times in the day. I should maybe orient the feeders across the bottom and the associated peak, as well as the technology here for summer on the left and winter on the right. This high efficiency scenario, again, the comparison was really the combination of envelope upgrades with more of a high efficiency cold climate, SEER 24 heat pump. And again, I think we have also induction stoves and heat pump clothes drying as that other high efficiency scenario. So we do see that the essentially results for confirming the efficiency is really having an impact on overall reduction and mitigating the increases in peak demand on this chart here. Again, largely driven in the efficiency scenario through heat pumps and envelope upgrades. So that kind of confirms our approach and our efficiency focused programs here in Fort Collins and across the region on continuing to pursue those incentives and working with customers to upgrade that equipment. Kind of more of the same. I wanted to get to kind of this dynamic with the thermal thresholds that we evaluated. Again, we did see, from a percentage standpoint and a megawatt standpoint, pretty substantial load growth across feeders, but not necessarily to the point where we saw increased risk associated with the infrastructure itself. And again, that's largely based on the cable and evaluation that we have. So on the right-hand side, we essentially say, okay, what are these maximum thresholds? What's the max amp draw that can be sustained by the cable for a certain amount of time, as you see here on the right? What amount of time at what temperature is going to result in a thermal overload, right? And so we explored both the frequency, how many times it happened in the scenarios that we modeled, and also not only how many times did it actually happen in the model, but how long did it last? So the duration of that potential risk. So first, this result is really showing, again, on the left side, this medium technology, this medium load growth scenario, the instances that the current was essentially the instances that the current fell in a certain range. So if you remember on my previous slide, the thresholds that we start to see thermal overload are actually right in this, on the high end, 600 amps, 700 amps at certain hours, right? Certain duration. In the results, we see that we're either, this is instances, we're not necessarily seeing that in the model. We're not seeing the amperage go up at the feeder level to reach that total amps that might risk that. And then in this result, this is kind of the duration. How long did we see the cable supporting that amperage in the model? And we see it's far below the time needed to result in a thermal overload for the infrastructure. So interesting results, right? And again, I think we're fortunate to have, again, this feeder level infrastructure and also the way that our distribution infrastructure is laid out. There's really a series of loops and redundancy in Fort Collins such that, if one feeder cable needs to be replaced, we could pretty easily not be out of service or not have a planned outage to service that line. We could essentially, through a series of switches, maintain power to our customers while working on the separate feeders. So that loop infrastructure, as well as the cable itself, really supports a high number or a high loading, if you will, on the individual feeders. I'm starting to talk a lot, Pete. I'll kind of wrap it up here. With really just kind of some observations throughout the study. EV modeling, we started to look at level 3 EV charging, decided to kind of throw it out the window because, well, it didn't necessarily meet the purposes of this study. Any level 3 EV site work that would need to be done would need to be pretty intensive. We'd be collaborating with a developer on the infrastructure. So it really wasn't a fit for this study. Whereas the level 2 charging, kind of behind the meter, was something that we'd be more interested in because we have less visibility into that in an ongoing manner. And, honestly, there's probably more of that happening than we're actually aware of. So, but we did see sensitivity to it, right? And whether or not, the timing of that EV charging happens all at once, we fully acknowledge that while at the feeder level, we could support a high level of electrification locally, at the transformer level, we could see a substantial amount of variability, right? If any one neighborhood has, 10 EVs adopted overnight, we're not able to monitor it. They all plug in at the same time. Everybody gets a heat pump installed too. It's the middle of winter. We just went through this cold snap. There is risk further downstream at the transformer level, right? However, we have a high level of confidence based on this study related to the feeder level infrastructure. And just again, doubling down on kind of the efficiency impacts. Essentially, if we're able to, through efficiency, mitigate 20% of the future electrification load growth, we need to be considering that as substantial avoided costs, and really telling that story and the benefit when it comes to efficiency. But I think, Pete, I'll leave it there. I think that was the last slide I had, and I'm happy to open it up to questions. And hopefully I did a good job at least giving a high level overview of what Sean and the Lawrence Berkeley Labs folks might have done. So.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, we do have a couple questions queued up. First one, are summer heat pump increases accounting for replacement of AC?
Yes. So you'll see that they have a higher impact in the winter. However, when we looked at buildings, essentially the feeder characterization, we assume that 75% of retrofits in Fort Collins would be replacing AC, and 25% essentially adding new load.
Okay. Are you also modeling any increase in storage, either batteries or even thermal storage? And if you did, how did that impact the demand?
Yeah, that's a great question. Battery storage wasn't specifically included in this. Mostly because, and this was just kind of, 6 people developing a study, it's really a value proposition that we can either provide through incentives or rates that's going to have kind of the biggest impact on how people use their batteries, right? And we hear it from solar installers all the time. It's like, 95% of the time, and even I think Justin from Sandbox at Odell last month mentioned, it's like, hey, give me the best economic version, right, of the program that you have for a residential battery. So we didn't necessarily model that because we feel like it's again the more customer decision in economics rather than the technology operating at the consumer level. So I don't know if that's the best explanation, but wasn't necessarily a focus of this work.
Yeah, it would make for a lot of modeling scenarios because there are multiple battery scenarios and then different percentages of who's going to choose which one. And you got to start somewhere with a baseline.
Yeah, it'd be great though, right? How can we incorporate, as you mentioned, some percentage of that solar generation, the minimum net demand that we're seeing, how can we cut that off and put that to a battery, and what might that result in from a load perspective? It's fascinating, but it wasn't included in this body of work.
Okay. And your graphs show an increase in demand. What are the absolute numbers on the increase?
Yeah, that 134% growth is represented by this 2.6 to 7.3%, or 2.6 to 7.3 megawatts. So essentially it's on a per feeder basis that we evaluated it, and not necessarily at a community level. It could be extrapolated to a community level, perhaps. But I did want to come back to the point that this was largely residential. In the short term, and we could argue about this, I do see more residential based electrification rather than commercial, excluding industrial. So I think we did it at the feeder level to be intentional around distribution planning efforts, mostly happening at the feeder level. But it could be rolled up, and we could look at it from the community level as well.
Okay, good. Would asking NREL to help do an evaluation of how VPP inputs are likely to appear to help? And aren't they the experts in that area?
Sure. Yeah, I think that was kind of out of scope for this study. I mentioned we initiated this work 2 years before, well, essentially 2 years before it was delivered. So mid 22 to late 22. And at the time, the partnership was really with LBL and leveraging that NREL load shape result, rather than really dialing into BPPs.
Okay, you check for thermal overload on cables. Are the transformers adequate in all the studied cases?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that kind of goes back to my previous statement I made. Like, we acknowledge that the transformer variability and the diversity of the load is across neighborhoods and even roads and everything else. That's going to vary, and we're going to have transformers that need upgrade and can't support essentially the load that they're seeing. We also see about 50% of our transformer failures occurring because of squirrels and other rodents, getting in and blowing the damn thing up. So, the variability in planning at the transformer level is difficult. We could monitor and do the best that we can there. However, the transformer level reliability is a little more reactive than we can be with, I think that we have 40, I think it's like 4,600 transformers versus the 80 feeders. So that's really, from a planning perspective, the approach that we decided to take for this study. Acknowledging that variability in transformers is just maybe too much.
Okay. How should business owners and homeowners coordinate planning with Fort Collins Utilities when they are planning for construction remodels that would significantly increase their electric loads? And then follow up, also, who pays for upgrades to the existing electric service to their businesses or home when it is determined new infrastructure is required?
Yeah, so I'll only speak for Fort Collins Utilities, but there's essentially a building site fee and an electric capacity fee that are both required when evaluating new service. I have an email address that I could provide. I think it's electrical project engineering at fcgov.com, but I could confirm that. Essentially, through the permitting process and evaluation of electric capacity fees and whether or not service upgrade even needs to be provided, you kind of get to this point where you determine essentially when that upgrade is complete and how much it's going to be. And that's going to vary based on a number of things, including the cost of boring for underground lines that might need to happen in the scenario of a accessory dwelling unit, as an example. Or, do you just have to replace the secondary cable that's kind of coming from the transformer to your house? Or are you looking at a full transformer replacement? So the variability has been identified as an issue in itself, right? It needs to be a lot more predictable. And we acknowledge that as a utility, and we're actually working to figure out how to better set the expectation with community members on what those costs are going to be. And is it fair that the first person that contributes and electrifies their home is the one stuck with the bill, and their neighbor gets to, upgrade their service based on you footing the bill for that transformer? All that work kind of happens within our electric service standards and what we do in supporting service upgrades in Fort Collins. We want to make it more equitable. We acknowledge that it's somewhat unpredictable, super variable, and challenging. That's why we encourage as much efficiency in minimizing behind the meter load ahead of electrifying through efficiency, circuit switches and other electrification strategies. So long answer to say, customers footing the bill, largely based in residential settings, and we're looking to figure out how that is a little more equitable.
Great. I'm going to throw in a little plug for the CRES YouTube channel here. This is mainly on the residential side, but in the last year and a half, we've had two presentations, one by Sean Lamons, who, if you know, you know, and the other one, I can't remember their name. It's a couple that they both work at NREL, and they both fully electrified I think they had 100 amp panels each, and they electrified their 50s and 60s era homes with EV charging as well. And yes, if you turned everything on at the time, it didn't going to work. And they had to do some monitoring to prove to Excel to allow them to do this. But it can be done. And, that's something that's maybe overlooked. And this is another reason, again, building envelope, get your efficiency to where, you're not going to have everything on at once. But, there is, you don't always have to upgrade if you, I think, really, really design intelligently. So going to throw in that plug. Check out those videos. They're both really, really good. And if you're just considering the pathway, check those out, as well as I know Go Electric Colorado featured Frank Ruby and Tony Mitchell on their projects. I think that might be in the mix. Either they already had it, but they're great resources up here as well. Okay, plug done. Okay, next question. Brian, could you tell us a little bit more about the study data and analytical work? What kind of technology or software were used to collect hourly load data, analyze it, and make the forecasting predictions?
Yeah, great question, and thanks. I kind of glossed over. So we relied on our 15-minute AMI advanced metering infrastructure equipment in order to provide data in aggregate at that feeder level to Lawrence Berkeley Lab. So they had actual, I forget how many years they used for essentially evaluating the existing conditions at that feeder level with aggregated meter data. So there was no separate monitoring done using e-gauge or span or anything like that. The load evaluations that were complete, and again, I'm not sure which tool LBNL used, but essentially they used the NREL load shapes developed in a recent project, and I'm spacing on the name of what that project was, but it was actually using a lot of Fort Collins data in order to forecast the change to the meter data. So essentially using this publicly available NREL load shape 8760 type load profile information with metered data based on the feeders in Fort Collins. Again, I'm not sure which tools were necessarily used in the evaluation and the analytics. Hopefully that at least tells you a little more about the inputs.
Okay, great. I have a question, and this is going to feed into, no pun intended, a follow-up webinar I'm trying to get set up. But right now we're looking so much at air source heat pumps, and we know they lose efficiency as we really go into those cold dips. And obviously, if they go to resistance heating, the load spikes. And this might be a little bit more for commercial property looking at right now, but ground coupled heat pumps. Is there, just from your knowledge, how much would that reduce that, literally it's not like we're building more efficiency into that heating equation because it's less sensitive to the cold, but, what do you think that would do to that winter peaking load?
Yeah, no, great question, Pete. From a ground source perspective, most of our conversations with community members and developers are for new construction type opportunities, right? The foundation of this work wasn't necessarily it was more based on existing feeders, existing infrastructure, retrofit type scenarios rather than kind of behind the meter and new construction. But yeah, as I might hypothesize that the load growth and load needs to serve the ground source resource would be lower than that, 134% growth and 59%. So, from a percentage standpoint in our efficiency programs, we have had some ground source interest and participation locally. It is on the order of 2 to 4% of the incentives that we provide. So I'm a believer. I think that it has its place. And it wasn't necessarily a big part of this work.
Yeah, I think it's still pretty nascent out here, and the speaker I'd like to line up would be some of the folks that are involved. I think there's at least 2 projects up in the Northeast where they're actually looking at doing district geothermal residential to replace gas. So this is really kind of an Excel gas thing if they want to keep providing heating and then get cooling as well. If I was in their business, I'd be looking at that transition model. It's a big, huge chasm for them to leap, but it's they have the pipes in the ground coming into your house. You just replace them with different pipes, but a little bit harder than that.
Yeah.
So any other questions before we wrap it up from the crowd? Okay, well, 3, 2, 1. Okay, well, Brian, I want to thank you again for presenting and want to thank everyone for joining us. Brian?
Pete, I just
appreciate it.
had 2 notes to
Oh.
follow up with a project engineering email, and also maybe just the full version of this deck that's a little more detailed than what I presented tonight. So
Yep,
thanks, everybody.
That's great. If you need that, email me and I'll get that from Brian.
Cool.
All right, thanks again.
Thanks.